Don't move, stay in the room. I would like to invite the panelists of the first plenary session onto the stage, and I will hand over to the moderator, Julia Everson, Head of Democracy, Digital Governance, Urban Development at GIZ, to moderate the panel. Please, Julia, come to the scene, and please, the panelists, can you join us as well?
Is it working? Oh, now I can hear myself. So thank you very much. I would like also to give you a very warm welcome to this first panel. I invite my panelists to come up here, please. So I'm very honored to moderate this first panel. We will talk about taking the pulse of OECD democracies. So welcome. So let me briefly introduce myself. I'm the head of Competence Center, it was mentioned, to Democracy, Digital Governance and Urban Development at GIZ. We are a service provider for international development and cooperation. We work worldwide, mainly on behalf of the German government, but also the European Commission in a variety of areas, including economic development, energy, environment, but also in the field of peace and good governance. So I'm very glad to moderate this panel and to talk about this very important topic today. I grew up, studied, and started my career in an era of optimism regarding democratic developments worldwide, at a time where we saw waves of democratization. Historians, political scientists already were discussing the famous end of history, and where the number of people living in democratic countries grew from year to year. Today, we're meeting in a very different environment, and the introductory remarks pointed to the challenging times for democracies worldwide, but also in the most established democracies in the OECD world. We're facing multiple and simultaneous crises. So, in this context, trust in public institutions is a very important indicator to measure how people perceive the quality and how they associate with government institutions in democratic countries. And you've heard the main findings of the OECD Trust Survey. I will from now on say OECD Trust Survey, not the entire title, because it's too long, but for the first time we have with it, and I also wanted to show you the book, a very comprehensive view of what drives trust in institutions. So this session will discuss how governments can deepen the democratic model and the levers to improve trust based on the results of this survey. I would like to welcome my panel. We have with us Karin Juhl. She's a state secretary at the Ministry of Local Government and Regional Development of Norway. Very warm welcome. We have with us Mr. Yves Le Terme, former Prime Minister of Belgium and member of the Club de Madrid. I would like to welcome Mr. Mario Nava. He's Director General of the Structural Reform Support, DG Reform of the European Commission. To my left side, Ms. Susana Codé-Roguera. She's a sector manager of institutions for development sector at the Inter-American Development Bank. And last but not least, Mr. Serge Allegresa. He's the director of the General of the Institute for Statistics and Economic Studies of Luxembourg. Very warm welcome to all of you. Yes, that's what I wanted to say also. So to start this panel, I would like to ask you all for your first 3 minutes impression on the results of the OECD Trust Survey. Was there anything that surprised you in particular, or that resonates the more with you? What are your impressions with regard to the results of the survey? Ms. Secretary the floor is yours.
It's work.
Yeah.
First of all, I would like to thank OECD for making this survey, and allow me to give a comments on this report based on the finding from Norway. You know that we were in the lucky position that you have made a very extensive report about Norway, and there have been a deep control of the Norwegian society's trust. And I live in a society where we believe that we have a high level of trust. The Norwegians are going around and talking, oh, we are in a position and we are lucky in a situation because in our society we have a high trust. And I was very happy to see the results of the reports, because our society, we have high trust. And it tells us that the public trust in Norway are considerably higher than in the OECD and the average. Let's mention the numbers. I think the trust for public institution is 77%, and the average in OECD is 47%. So from this point of view, I think it's good for us. It wasn't shocking to see it, because we have made some surveys about the same for many, many decades, and it's been the same for the last 5-6 decades. So our challenge is to keep it on this high level, and there was also some very important information in the survey that tells us that we need to do something to keep it on this level. But I would like to mention some of the findings, because the findings tell us that most of the citizens think that the decisions are transparent. Most of the people are satisfied with the quality of the public services. Citizens trust that the public administration abides laws and regulation, and most believe that they will be treated fairly if they approach the government. But we also find some dark skies here, and I think these dark skies is very serious, and I think for politicians it's something we have to deal with the coming years, because it's very difficult. Only 1 in 3 believe that innovation is widespread in the public sectors in Norway. And to be honest, for a year ago, before I was appointed as a state secretary, I think I would be among these 2/3 of the population who think that the innovation is not widespread. Because we have an impression that the public sector is lacking behind the private sector. We are not very clever to introduce new technology, but the situation is quite opposite, but the people didn't know it, but we have to deal with it every day. The second find that worries is that less than half think that the public administration is doing enough to adapt the future challenges, and that means challenges like aging population, that our society is becoming more and more diverse, of course the climate change, and also people afraid that we are not able to ensure a sustainable welfare system. But in this report, I think there was some explanation about the high trust that we have to keep and continue to work on. Because the report tells us that the reason that we have so high level of trust is because of our robust welfare state system, where we provide high quality services, and that this contributes that the level of inequality is very low. And when you have low inequality in a society, there is it goes hand in hand with social cohesion. At least I will also mention some findings. I think it's common for all the countries inside the OECD, and that is that lower level of lower level trust among people with low income, low education, people from rural districts, and minorities, the people from the minorities. And to say it with more simple words, it means that it's angry men in the rural district with low education, and they are sitting there on internet with the cap locks on and writing angry things about all others. So we have to deal with these challenges, because this is something of the things make the polarization of our society. So this is common for the Norwegian society, and it's also common for the whole OECD, that we have to deal with people who think they are not inside, are included in our society. Yes, I don't know. I think it's. I think all the OECD countries have to comply on this report for the coming years, and I think, in spite of the high level of trust in the Norwegian society, there is so many findings that we have to deal with and we have to work on as a politicians and also as public servants for the coming years, because to keep a high level of trust is not thing we have to take granted. We have to work every single day to keep on this level, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So, Minister Leterme, what were your perceptions with regard to the report?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. I would like to commend, of course, the former colleagues of the OECD. Let me summarize my impressions by referring to what I consider 4 major challenges that are translated, I think, in the outcome of the survey. 4 major challenges for democratic governance, which I think we should be very well aware of before trying to find solutions to issues. The number 1 is Uberization of society and a certain degree of inadaptation of political opinion making and political decision making faced with this Uberization. Uberization that is all over the place now, in trade, in industry, social media, and so on. There's no single reason why politics would be a kind of insulated part, would be a kind of island that would not be impacted very severely by this Uberization, which means basically that all the intermediary levels are just eroded, or even more, or just put aside in a very short period of time. Meanwhile, our system, our representative democracy is still very much in demand, but the crisis is the one of representative democracy, is, to summarize and to put it bluntly, it's a system that was invented in the 19th century, that got more blood and flesh through the mass membership parties of the 20th century, and we think we can address the new challenges of the 21st century by using these 19th century institutions, putting legitimacy or having legitimacy on this mass membership political parties and all this intermediary opinion making and decision making. Fact is, this has all disappeared, and until now we haven't found a very straightforward solution to that. And it's very nuanced. I think the solution should be customized, should be diverse, and I think the Prime Minister of Luxembourg has pointed at different kinds of new participatory schemes. I think the solution is in that direction, but it's not yet very clear at this moment where this leads us to. So, number 1, Uberization, no clear response until now. We should invest more in finding adapted solutions adapted to the 21st century. The second element is what I would call the increased disconnect between the vote of people, which is the fundamental characteristic of our system, is that we have a say, at least theoretically, in what is happening on behalf of us by voting. There is an increased disconnect between the vote of people, and the outcome of the vote. 2 examples. Multi-level governance is needed to address issues. I mean, I preach for the convinced. OECD people know very well, and they speak about this, that global challenges should be addressed globally, and so that we need this multi-level governance and at least multilateral cooperation in all its forms. The issue being that individual citizens feel a kind of disconnect. They say, this is not my guy who's speaking on TV. When we had to address the financial crisis in 2008 and the debt crisis in 2010, to be frank and open, and that's the privilege of being a former, it was not us that brought a solution. It was Jean-Claude Trichet and it was Mario Draghi, people that had never been elected. And so having this crisis that impacts very severely people, it's about their wallets, it's about their savings, and seeing not the elected officials, but technocrats, very respected technocrats, take essential decisions on interest rates, on the value of their salary, this is going against the feeling that they had something to say about their future. There's a very good book that was written, I think, 5-6 years ago, if my memory serves me well, by Philip Coggan. I tried on my way to this meeting room to find back the right time. I think it's The Last Vote. And Coggan describes very well how this double delegation, representative democracy means a delegation to a delegate. You delegate for 4 or 5 years, your right to have a say in your future to a delegate. But the problem is that since 40, 50 years, forced by reality, we have installed another delegation to technocrats, to not elected people. Fair enough, it's needed, but people feel this disconnect. Third element, I think we should face the reality of what I would call a delivery gap. Politics is too often big on small and small on big, especially in democracies. Because of the fierce competition to win elections, there's an enormous imbalance between the promises made in electoral campaigns and the reality afterwards. The problem being, especially in mature economies, and OECD membership is based on mature economies, the problem being that the discussion now is more about sharing the burden than to share the profits. We lived during 40, 50 years in a kind of mutually reinforcing dynamics of social progress, economic progress on the one hand, and on the other hand, democratic breakthrough. And the one was giving legitimacy to the other. This phenomenon is now on the other side of the room. It's in autocracies, it's in China and in other countries. So this delivery gap is really a very important issue. Last but not least, I think, and there I have the privilege to have been living as an elected official, doing lots of electoral campaigns, leading government, holding the EU presidency and so on in politics, but also experiencing a little bit since some years what's happening in business, what's happening in other parts of the world and in other parts of society. I chair, for instance, a roundtable to tackle homelessness. Well, I think we have, through the need for more professional approaches, given the complexity of issues, we have been, let's say, deepening the decoupling of the political world and the real world. When I think about my 25 years in elected positions, there were almost no blue-collar workers in parliament. I didn't see nurses in the municipality bodies and so on. When I take the subway in Paris, and that's also the habit, I think, of OECD people, the people that you see coming in from the banlieue to do the dirty jobs in Paris, it's fair to say that they are almost not represented. Or to take an example from the other side of the social stratification, I worked recently with CEOs of very big companies, very big organizations in professional sport, in auto business. Well, I was struck by the kind of language they were using about political decision-making and by the lack of knowledge about what it is to run a democracy, what it is to run as a chancellor of a country. So this decoupling of these worlds, I think, is my fourth element. And I see all these things translated in the results. On the urbanization, the political parties have the least trust or obtaining the lowest scores. in trust. On multilateral governance, when you clearly look at the results, you see a kind of, let's say, suspicion about what's happening above the heads of the people, not on the national or local level. And you see even more trust at the local level, of course, than on the supranational level. On the delivery gap, people are decreasingly sure that governments will deliver on the essential features of their existence, and the decoupling is also very clear in the figures coming out in this study. Thank you.
So, thank you very much for this analysis of the main gaps and challenges. Mr. Navar, from the European Commission side, what were your impressions on the results?
Bonjour et merci beaucoup d'abord. Merci pour l'invitation et l'honneur que vous faites à la Commission et félicitations.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor for the Commission. Thank you very much for the OECD for testing trust in our democracies and for that report.
Notoriously, the economists understand only two sides, the demand side and the supply side. And I tell you what I have understood by reading the report through my obviously limited prisma of the demand side and the supply side. On the report tells us very clearly that on the demand side, the demand that we are putting on governments, and here I join very much Prime Minister Leterme when he says the word governments has become a plural word, so it means many things. But the demand that we are putting on governments is increasingly more and more complex, much more complex. What citizens are asking today to the government is not what they were asking 1 year ago. Migration, management, refugee crisis is not what they were asking 3 years ago. What Prime Minister Bettel said, the equilibrium point between restricting liberties and letting the economy going. So increasingly, we live in a crisis. It has been evoked the financial crisis, then the debt crisis in Europe, and then of course the COVID and all of that. So the last 20 years, 15, 20 years have been years of so many crises that inevitably the demand side has gone up. Equally, however, and that is the good news, is that against all odds, also the supply side of governments has gone up. Why do I say against all odds? Because the pendulum of what to do with public administration has swung a lot in the last, even intellectually, in the last 20 or 30 years, we moved to a period where we thought we needed less state or we need more outsourcing or whatever. But against all the odds, public administration, and of course I'm talking generally and on average, public administration have been able, through a number of difficulties, but still they have been able to deliver. In economics, we know that when the demand goes up and the supply goes up, the final equilibrium point, so price in a market or trust, when you talk about the government, the result is uncertain. And here is where your report comes, because here the report tells us, well, look, trust has been held. So the traditional question that I need to pose to myself is, through what? What has been the mechanism that has allowed the trust to still remain as a very good level? I mean, some up and down and so on and on, but trust is still there. And there, I think I join very much what Gunnar said at the very beginning. It's innovation. But not only innovation in the banal sense, but the fact that the governments, lato sensu again, have been obliged, compelled to continuously innovate in the last 10, 15 years. If you want, innovation somehow has become part of the resilience factor of a government. A government could not continue to deliver unless it would innovate, unless it would find a solution to a problem that did not exist a year ago. We need to find quickly a solution to the COVID. We need to find quickly a solution to how to defend Europe, democracy, and all the issues we have been talking this morning. So I think that basically the true point is the point of innovation. Innovation as a stabilization factor, as a resilience factor. Is this new? Pardon me the play of word. Is the innovation new? I think what has become truer and truer is that innovation has been institutionalized, and you find in the report several hints to that. Also through, for example, a better connection with the scientific world and all of that, a better way of doing legislation, the vast stakeholders consultation, the evidence-based, all of that. But innovation is not new per se. I mean, we have had instances of innovations, and even when you look at the 5 drivers, we have had instances of areas where we face with a new problem, we try to apply one of the drivers, 1 or 2 or 3 of the drivers, and it worked. Sitting here by the Prime Minister of Belgium, the former Prime Minister of Belgium, I cannot resist to mention one thing that, for example, in any finance school is well known, the Leterme bonds. The Leterme bonds was a very clear example of how applying in openness, the Prime Minister said very clearly what was the situation, said what was the issue that he wanted to tackle, made a very clear deal with citizens. The Leterme bonds would have been understood by kids of 8 years old. There was no complicated finance. It was a very clear deal, and it worked. And I believe this is what the report is teaching us all, how to make sure that we perpetuate innovation in our public policy making. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Nava. So, Susanna, now we're going outside of Europe. We're crossing the Atlantic to Latin America. So perhaps from your perspective and from your knowledge also of the continent, what surprised you the most, or what resonates with you from the survey?
So thank you. I'd like to thank you for the organizers of the forum. It's a privilege to be here in this panel and have this discussion. Also want to congratulate the OECD for the launch of this tremendous publication, very timely and prescient. And as Julia just said, I think I bring to the panel the developing country perspective in addition to the multilateral development bank perspective. And from that end, I've found the recent comments very interesting in that they converse well with what struck me the most from these findings, which was, on the one hand, so just stepping back having served in the government in Brazil and then working with counterparts now in a multilateral, the Inter-American Development Bank, and prior at the World Bank, always the goal and then the bottom line per se of our work is to improve the quality of service delivery. We do that through different mechanisms, but making services be of quality and reach citizens efficiently and in a timely manner is the holy grail in the business of development. And so I was struck by this apparent disconnect between 2 sets of findings in the survey. One was that on the one hand, you saw that citizens are satisfied with services at a basic level. They're satisfied with education, with health, with administrative services. So you see that the baseline is there, and there is a satisfaction in a broad sense. But on the other hand, it was interesting to see that citizens feel that they're not as connected to their government, that their complaints are not heard, that they don't have enough opportunities to participate in policy making. And so if you put these 2 together, it seems like a paradox, because thinking from a developing country perspective, in the sense that if services are working and if you're satisfied with them, then why do you have at the same time this feeling of alienation, this feeling that you're not connected? And I think a lot of the discussions so far in the panel have pointed out to possible mechanisms that may be missing or not being alluded to, and drive this difference between the developing country context and the OECD context. And I'd love to hear more explanations for why this difference may exist, and would love to continue the discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Susanna. Mr. Allegressa, you're the chief statistician of your country, so for you it's bread and butter to analyze these kind of reports. What resonates with you?
Yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity to let statisticians speak about numbers. Normally, we are totally neglected because it's used as an infrastructure, and we take it for granted that those numbers are good numbers. So let me underline and underscore the importance of official statistics and the importance of institutions producing public numbers and which are nurturing the political debate in our democracies. Imagine if you don't have a consensus on the basic numbers, what do you want to discuss? I have to pay tribute to the OECD Statistics Division, which pioneered statistics on trust in others and trust in institutions. In 2017, the OECD published a very influential manual called Guidelines on How to Measure Trust, which is now used in all surveys on trust, including the ones that you alluded to. And I have to thank Martine Durand, because at the time she was chief statistician, and she had to fight to convince us that it is an important statistics to collect. But she managed to do it by remembering that it's a kind of social capital and it is basic in our societies. It explains, for example, growth to a large extent. My message is about independence of statistics. This is best illustrated by a recent upsetting news. Media reported that the president of Turkey sacked the chief statistician. His crime: publishing inflation data, the president felt it overstated the true situation of the economy. So feelings trump facts. The Turkish ex-chief statistician Dincer was quoted with the words, "Can you imagine that hundreds of my colleagues could stomach or remain quiet about publishing an inflation rate very different from what they have established?" Indeed, I think in this audience, for us, we don't dare to imagine that this is a normal thing. And I express my sympathy and solidarity to our Turkish colleagues, and to all the colleagues. We have to work in very difficult conditions, and I include, of course, our Ukrainian colleagues. So official statistics is a public good, and it should be freely accessible to every citizen. Unfortunately, our recent study on European countries shows that trust in statistics is unequally distributed among socioeconomic categories, education levels, and among countries, for example, between Western countries and in Eastern Europe, between newer countries, the newer member state and the older ones. And about half, listen, about half of the European citizens trust official statistics. And it can go as high as 70%, correlates with the study which is presented today, and it can go as low as 33%. Luxembourg is luckily on the high end. So we need to enhance numeracy by educating pupils and students, building competence to decipher data, interpreting graphs and figures. And this is something that we should be part of enlightened citizens. We need to combat fake news and alternative facts to encourage systematic fact-checking based on official statistics. So our modern societies are governed by numbers. They are ubiquitous in our daily life. But official numbers are trustworthy only if they are relevant, reliable, accurate, timely, and built on agreed and supervised standards. And I would suggest to include trust in numbers in the next survey on the trust in governance, because it's crucial. We have shown it that it is crucial in forming trust in institutions and in governments. And we have perhaps to think about the notion of trust, because trust it's not something where you have a credulous attitudes in front of institutions. And I would like to quote a very recent book by Pippa Norris, where she said, the book is In Praise of Skepticism. And the book, there is a subtitle saying, Trust but Verify.
Thank you very much. So I would like to take our last minutes on this panel actually already to discuss a bit more now. You set really the scene, all the topics are on the table, and so perhaps we could use the possibility, and we will have the possibility to discuss this in deep over the whole day, to gain a more forward-looking perspective. So now that everything is on the table, what do we do with the results, and how could this guide policies? Susanna, from your perspective, how do you perceive these kind of results, also surveys, could be used for a new wave, let's say, of public reform in the countries you're working? And I'm very sorry, it's a very interesting discussion, but I have to limit you to more or less 1 minute, so we can still have the possibility to open to the floor, perhaps.
So I'll try to be very brief. So in answering your question, I think the survey is a very thoughtful and useful tool for policymakers, but I'd like to focus on the implementation challenge, and by virtue of our business in development, and there's an aspect of surveying that perhaps is underemphasized sometimes in these discussions, and that's when you implement reform and being able to involve the rank and file civil servants in the design of this reform. And we found that in emerging economies, it's extremely helpful to involve those stakeholders since the beginning. And not so much for the obvious reasons where there's ownership and increased accountability, but most importantly, I would argue, for a possibility to enhance their capability to implement the reform. So oftentimes there's a low base, skill base, and involving the rank and file in the design from an early stage in a very agile manner, as Prime Minister Lehmann mentioned, is particularly consequential for the success of the reform. And that entails a training in real time, in an apprenticeship style of learning and capacity building within those governments, both at the federal and subnational level. And the challenge is that it's tremendously costly to do that in the beginning of the reform, and it gains a lot of momentum when you have the ability to implement surveys in that capability building. So it's an extremely useful tool to engage in this participation in a layered manner as you sequence reform. But ultimately, in a sense where you reverse the logic of development, instead of going to that country context and trying to find the problem for which you have a tool set to solve. So everything looks like a nail when you have a hammer. You inverse that logic and rather try to promote those good practices, and doing so through this engagement and through these surveys is a form to enhance these homegrown solutions and encourage them to accelerate the pace of development in these emerging economies. So examples such as this one will be extremely relevant when customized to the developing country context. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Susanna. Mr. Navar, with regard to your work in the strengthening of capacity of public administration through Europe, perhaps you could give us just one example where you see the results could be useful for your reform programs.
Sure. 1 minute, one example. A week ago in Brussels, Elsa Pilichowski, Minister Scherzos of Greece, the Director General of JRC, and myself, we opened up a study on strengthening the capacity for evidence-based policy making. It was a multi-country with 7 countries, Greece, Belgium, Netherlands, Czech Republic, and the 3 Baltics. And that is a very clear example that embodies all the 5 drivers. It embodies reliability, it embodies openness, it embodies integrity, because what Serge said about numbers saying the truth, more or less, and then the ability for policy making to taking in the truth that comes from numbers, it's exactly what we are doing. So I believe in our regular policy making, but also in the way, for example, the Commission deals with financial markets. I mean, the whole Next Generation EU is all made by speaking the truth to financial markets. We go to the financial markets, we issue bonds for a project. And that's, without trust, would be impossible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nava. Ms. Yule, you already mentioned in your first comment that Norway is amongst one of the OECD countries that is really pioneering on the topic of trust. So perhaps you could give us an example of one key policy or initiative with regard to trust you're implementing, and that could be inspired by the results.
Please allow me to mention 3.
Okay.
We really work hard to implement the recommendation from the OECD report, and because they have done a deep dive in our trust in Norway, we have been starting to do a job. But just mention one thing. When I mentioned that we have there are more lack of trust for people living in the rural area, lower education, low income. We are dealing very much with plain language, that the public institutions should be better to communicate with the people. So this is the first thing. The second thing, and I think that will make the director for Luxembourg Statistic very happy, that we are trying to implement this survey in our statistic in Norway, that we have every second year, and survey about the trust in the Norwegian society, and we implement it in Norwegian statistic, and we try to use it in the politics development. And the third thing I would like to mention, and that is maybe the most difficult to do, that we have introduced or we have launched a trust reform in the Norwegian public sector, inside the whole sector. And it means that we try to delegate or to give more power to the people working in the front line in our healthcare, in the school system, in the waste managers, because we see that the school teacher, they need trust from their leaders, from the politician, to do their job. And of course, they don't lack trust, but the problem is that our societies have been so complex at the last time that there is more and more control regimes. So the teachers and the people working in the healthcare, they do more and more times by reporting and write reports, and more and less time to do their real job. So we try to cutting the red tapes, but also to give them more time to, and also to, let's say that I think that they think that they must have a more opportunity to use their professional skills, because they think that there are so many others who try to tell them in detail what they have to do in their job. So I think if we succeeded in this trust reform, cutting red tapes, give more more power to the people working in the front line of our society, I think we will make better. I think our healthcare and our school system would be better, but also I think we'll see the people living in the rural district with low income and low education. So I think it will strengthen our democracy.
Thank you, Ms. Yule. Very interesting examples. Mr. Allegressa, you already pointed out the importance of the statistics, but we've seen in the results the question of responsiveness is one that we need to tackle. So I would like to ask you, how could the public be involved, not only in answering or responding to surveys, but also into discussing the results later on and the consequences of it?
They should answer surveys because all the statisticians know that response rates are going down, and it's a real challenge, and it reflects probably the individualistic tendencies in our societies. And it's so important to explain to people that statistics is a public good, and so collectively we have to contribute to it to make sure that we have all representative data of a good quality. Even big data can't substitute for some forms of surveys. And so it's important to make clear that it is a collective good, as everybody has to contribute to it. It's like paying taxes. So you pay an information you give to the collectivity so that the collectivity can understand itself better and can take better decisions. So the questions that you're asking is about how to make sure that stakeholders are interested, so to participate. And all the statisticians we have in place, some forms of consultant organisms where they can express their views. But we know from experience that it's very, very complicated because at least in statistics, it's seen as something quite complex and difficult to understand. And so it's quite difficult to make sure that people participate actively. But I think one way is to go to schools, to the university, to explain why statistics is so important. You can't imagine how undervalued that statistics is, even in normal in the normal course in other disciplines. It's still undervalued. Probability, as Kahneman has shown in his fantastic book Fast and Slow, even in the faculties of medicine, they have difficulties to apply basic theorems. So you have to know that it's quite complicated, and you have to explain to people why statistics is important in their life by simple examples. And I think this is the way forward, at least for us.
Okay, thank you very much. Last but not least, Minister Leterme, you said you were preaching to the converted when talking about multilateralism, but still, in view of the evidence and the global challenges democracies are facing, how do you think could this evidence may fed into this multilateral discussions, such as the ones you are holding with the Club de Madrid?
Thank you very much. So I represent here Club de Madrid, which is, well, in summarizing, it's a club of former heads of state and government, most of them retired. To answer your question, just point at the work we did last year. We sat together with 12, 15 of these former leaders. We also engaged in a good conversation with International IDEA that specialized in democratic governance and some American corporates. And we were thinking about, also based on statistics and opinion polls that are very close, give very close results that are very close to the ones in the OECD survey. We were thinking about what are the kind of recommendations that could be put forward in order to improve the performance of democracy faced with challenges. Because we think that the challenge of emergency is there to stay. There's quite a famous saying in French, gouverner c'est prévoir. Mr. Thiès said that, one of the presidents of the Third Republic. I think the assessment now is that for leaders, that for political systems, I think including for multilateral organizations like the OECD, the reality is not so much gouverner c'est prévoir, but gouverner is to manage the unpredictable, because we are going from crisis to crisis. And so we've been thinking about 5 essential things, amongst others, to improve the performance of democratic governance faced with challenges of emergencies. And I think they all meet the results, the outcome of the OECD survey. Number one, it's a kind of emergency plan for the fundamental functioning of democracies. We've seen, for instance, in the COVID-19 crisis, and it has been said before, the first reaction is to put aside the fundamental rules of democracy, because the parliament couldn't meet the first weeks, because the judiciary had problems to organize its buildings, and so was also put aside. And governments were kind of narrowing their activities to only the COVID-19 and having restrained cabinet meetings. So the number one is to be prepared for the next crisis and to adapt the functioning, kind of emergency planning for the basic institutions of democracy, including just, well, simple things as how can we meet more? Because after a certain period of time, we had online meetings, and I think the normal functioning of these institutions resumed. But basics is be prepared and have a kind of emergency B plan when faced with an emergency like COVID-19, the consequences of it. How do we make sure that the basic fundamental institutions and rules of democratic governance are still respected? Number two, contrary to the normal tendency, is to even put more efforts in opening the space for civic participation, because crises are decisive moments in the perception by citizens of their governance, of the governance system, but there's also a moment where people want to contribute. Lots of people, the silent majority, maybe have a positive attitude. There's a kind of negativity bias in assessing the behavior of citizens, but give it a place. Give them more room to interact and to give their opinions and to participate, number two. Number three, and there, of course, the experience of the colleague from the statistics domain is crucial, and of the OECD also, is to preempt and to counter disinformation. And I think we should not underestimate what figures, reality, what truths, what factual truths, and what studies, benchmarking and so on by institutions like the OECD can contribute to strengthen the position of just a factual truth. Third principle, and certainly in faced with emergencies, and this includes, of course, also strengthening the position of journalism, even investigative journalism. Third principle, but that more applies, I think, to leaders, is that communication with empathy is crucial. Communication with empathy, and to leave a little bit the normal, very vertical approach of governmental communication of just telling what is the result of the decision making, but to start your communication, I won't elaborate in technicalities, it's not my specialty either, but to really communicate with empathy, starting from the positions of the ordinary citizens and families that are faced with the emergency. Last but not least, and we saw a little bit of a failure, I think, in that domain, certainly at the start in some including in some EU member states, and also in autocracies, is that in times of emergencies, even more effort has to be put into international cooperation. International cooperation for obvious things, when it's about financial crisis, debt crisis, about monetary stability, it's about helping each other in terms of finding sufficient money to serve the debt service. COVID-19 was about sharing knowledge, about exchanging good practices, and so on. This is a fifth important principle, and we saw a little bit of infringement or action against this very important principle. So these are 4 or 5 recommendations that come out of this report. You can find it on the website of Club de Madrid, that I think very well meet, at least that's my personal opinion, that very well meet the outcome of building trust, the study done by the OECD.
So thank you very much. This is already nearly an agenda proposition for the next day. So I'm very sorry with regard to our scarce time. I'm very sorry we can't open for the audience at this moment, but I think this panel showed that the topic is very relevant and very high on the agenda, and we have the whole day to deep dive on many of these aspects. I would like to point out that this panel really, and your discussion and your points really showed that the whole of society dialogue is needed between policymakers, civil society, business, and expert to rebuild trust. And here in the audience, and also in our virtual audience, that's really the chance to do so, because we are here in this composition. So Today we will have the opportunity to discuss on these topics with several panels and breakout sessions, but also in coffee breaks. And I wish us all a very nice day, and thank you very much for opening this panel and to taking the pulse of OECD democracy. Thank you very much.